Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Munch and Learn. I'm Elizabeth Sloan, your hostess, and the Public Programs Coordinator here at the Dixon. We'll go over a few reminders and pieces of housekeeping information before we start. Just to let everybody know, Munch and Learn will continue virtually through October. Per usual, we are recording this session, and you can find each week's talk published on the Dixon YouTube channel. So if you ever want to revisit a talk or make a recommendation to a friend, you can find them there. And since we're recording, we ask for everyone to remain on mute the entire time. If for some reason you accidentally unmute, please don't be offended if we do remute you. If you have any questions during the talk, please type them in the chat and we'll get them read and our speaker will be able to answer all your questions. Now I'd like to introduce our speaker, Zeanya Cruz. Zyanya was born in Southern California to her parents, Caroline, unenrolled first generation out of the residential school, Mescalero, Apache, and Mexican, and Dennis, Seneca, also unenrolled. She has grown up in ceremony and is very involved in Native American church in Mississippi. She graduated with honors from Overton High School and cum laude as a first generation student from the University of Memphis. She's a jingle dancer, activist organizer, and former high school educator. While teaching at a local school, she advocated for representation and support for Latinx students, with whom she founded the Indigenous and Hispanic Student Association to bring awareness to the existence, culture, struggles, and resistance of Indigenous peoples. Zeanya is involved in many organizations here in Memphis and has also spoken internationally on cultural appropriation and the water crisis. Zeanya, Eileen, and Maria are also the drivers behind the Three Sisters Land Project. Zeanya, thank you so much for joining us. The floor is
Thank
yours.
you. Thank you for having me. It always feels weird to hear your bio read back to you. Like making 1,000 notes of everything that I want to change about it now. But thank you to everyone for joining us and for letting me be in this space with you. And so also thank you to Elizabeth, who's going to be sharing our presentation today. The Dixon, Margarita, and Elizabeth invited my colleague and I, Amanda Lee, who did a lot of the research and labor behind the slides that you'll see today, but she could not make the talk, unfortunately. But we're going to talk to you today about missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And it's a lot of times referred to as missing and murdered Indigenous women. But that kind of cuts out a lot of like the trans people and then just all of our relatives in general that do go missing at higher rates. Yeah, so I think without further ado, we can go ahead and get started. So you can see here, there's pictures of jingle dancers, and this was done as a part of the Jingle Dance Project. A lot of the symbols around this crisis are like red dresses. So you'll see the color red used a lot. If you look up MMIR, MMIW, MMIW2GS, all of these acronyms basically talking about all of the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives that we have, women, girls, two-spirit relatives. So we can keep going. So the stats are listed in the next slide, and it's pretty, are you able to, yeah. And so basically the number since 2016, and obviously we're in 2021, was 5,712 missing and or murdered Indigenous relatives. Well, this one is particularly women that were reported missing, but only 116 of those were logged into the Department of Justice database. And about, you know, I don't want to read the statistics off to you, but if you look at a pie chart of that, that's basically a little tiny sliver. And a lot of it has to do with jurisdictional issues that are kind of built into the system because Indian land has different laws, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But yeah, so you can see that bottom number there. There is a noise happening, and I'm not sure where that's happening from. Let me see.
I think that might be on your end.
Okay. All right. And I just muted somebody. I'm not sure who. My apologies.
No, it's okay. That's okay.
But yeah, so, and then about 96% of the violence that is being reported happening to Indigenous women is, not happening from a Native offender, which is really strange when you look at crime statistics, because crimes of proximity, usually the crimes that are happening are within community because you're close to each other. So we'll keep moving. And again, if you have any questions at any point in this, just drop it in the chat, because if I see it, I'll try to answer it, unless I know we're going to get to it soon, because we're going to go through a lot of topics today. But yeah, so we're going to start right at the beginning. Not the beginning of Indigenous people, of course, but at the beginning of colonizers. But, we're coming to this understanding of, settlers, everyone that's non-native and or brought here, not by choice. Those are settlers. Settlers, their understanding of us kind of starts on contact. And so we've got Christopher Columbus here, who was just kind of a genocidal rapist. And, we're still celebrating him nationally. But these are just some of his quotes. Talking about how few men it would take to subjugate Indigenous people. He often talks a lot in his journals about like the hospitality of Indigenous people when he landed on Hispaniola, saying, that people could be robbed blind because they were giving, and brought lots of diseases. But yeah, so we're talking about him coming into contact with people and there's a lot of exchange that happens with disease, and then also just violence that he and his men inflicted on the Taino people, which were the people in Hispaniola, what is now called Hispaniola, the island of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And it was kind of like the beginning of the dehumanization of Indigenous people, kind of referring to anyone that was not a European white man as, non-human, non-Christian, and that's kind of how they're able to subjugate this group of Indigenous people to all of the genocide, slaughter, rape that did take place. And it did start 500 years ago, but it hasn't ever ended. And so when we look at the way that Indigenous people are represented in media in mass, it's still usually using this stereotypical savage type depiction. And so we go to the next slide, and it's and you're already there. And we talk about forced migration and ethnic cleansing, and the reason, so Amanda Lee actually put this slide together. The reason she didn't want to use any images of like the Trail of Tears that we kind of in the South know a lot about, because there's a couple of markers that you'll see along the highways, and they just added a new marker of the Trail of Tears talking about the removal, forced removal. The language is not always all of that clear on that. It's not like people just decided to pick up and move, but the forced removal of Choctaw, Chickasaw, Quapaw, Cherokee, Seminole people from their lands. A lot of them crossed right through here. And the reason that she chose not to use images of that removal is because she just wanted to focus on a more modern depiction of how these practices and how these violent acts still have an impact on our peoples today. So this piece was done by a Native person, and it depicts kind of like the impacts that this generational trauma has had. And so you can see that there. And I think it might say, yeah, the artist Jamie Lee Poindexter. You can look him up and look up some more of their work. And then we'll go to the next one, and it's basically we're talking about, if you the thought was if you kill the Indian, you save the man. And that's kind of just the continuation of that dehumanization theme. And you see You see a lot of this in like products and mascots, Halloween costumes, and even just in the celebration of someone that committed genocide. But not often do you see like the representation of indigenous people, even in maps. You don't see like indigenous land outlined. You don't see tribal land or tribal nations outlined on maps. So what happened with forced removal is that it effectively separated whole indigenous communities from their traditional homelands. And in these homelands, people had ways of, making sure that they were eating, making sure that they had good relationship with the land, making sure that they know how the water systems worked and what things to eat, what things to move around and to harvest, and what things, just how to handle everything. A lot of our ceremonies are tied to our traditional homelands. And so in this removal, it separates people from essentially like our mother, our life giver. And then it forced people to reestablish new territories in so-called Indian land, Indian territory, or reservations. So a really good thing to do if you're interested in like looking up just like how you as a settler that wasn't alive maybe 500 years ago, 400 years ago, 200 years ago, is to look up whose land you're actually sitting on. Now, the idea of land ownership is colonial in essence, but for beginning this process, it's okay to think about it like that, and then you can move deeper into understanding like being in relationship to the land. But you being on the land that you're actually sitting on right now essentially dispossessed someone and continues to make sure that some group of people don't have access to their traditional homelands because this land was not unoccupied. And so that's really important, just as you think about your own place in the world, your home, your family's home, if you have a vacation home, or if you go on vacation to Hawaii, Latin America, all of these places are colonized, and all of these places have endured violence and displacement that was forced by violence, by disease, and all of that. And so this map just kind of shows Oklahoma, which has a majority of the land is actually native land, at least in jurisdiction with one of the latest rulings. And you don't see that highlighted on the map. And so I just thankful that we're able to point that out here today. I don't see any questions in the chat. I thought we might have some after that. So if you do have some, now we're gonna kind of switch gears, but we'll come back to it if you do have some more questions. And so we're getting into like the idea of land and separation a bit more.
We do actually have a question to just come in.
All right.
What do you think about white people who inherit land and decide to give it back to members of the nation who used to live there before they were forcibly removed? From Paula.
Oh yeah, I think about that's great. I wish that more white people, more settlers would do that. It's a great it's a great way to show your allyship. And also I think a lot of times it doesn't necessarily mean that if you live there you will be like dispossessed, because that is a colonial thought. So Paula, thanks for bringing that up. You can always give your land back. There's a whole movement around land back, and that just means giving land back to indigenous people and to the traditional caretakers of the land, which does include people brought here by force that were enslaved. And so land back means essentially this. And also for anybody that might be more reticent or hesitant to kind of think about this movement in a way that is holistic, it doesn't mean that like you don't have a place to live. Like maybe if you have lots of other places to live, you can go live somewhere else if you want. But the way that land back works is, it's returning land back, and any dispossession that would kind of occur it's not really the theme of it. Land back is something that would be healing, because if you look at the wildfires even that we're having right now, right? So we look at national parks. National parks in their existence, in their inception, were racist because Indigenous people lived there, and the entire ecosystem of Turtle Island, or Canada, United States, Mexico, South America, was taken care of by people who understood the harmony and like how to make sure that things were regenerating. And so when sections of land were maintained for essentially white recreation, people were dispossessed of land again. And then now the way that people used to take care of things by like burning underbrush and doing all that stuff in time hasn't been maintained. And so now you see these massive wildfires that are happening in California and in Oregon. And that is a direct result of dispossession. So land back would only be good for everyone, because it would mean a return to traditional land keeping practices. So Paula, thank you. Definitely do that. We have a place on our website where if you're interested in donating your land back, that you can do that, and we'll go through our website in a bit too. And then yeah, we can move forward. So the Dawes Act, which was kind of like the Allotment Act, was one of the specific laws that was used to break up tribal land. And it kind of just allowed for what land that was communally taken care of, communally in relationship with people, to kind of separate it into parcels, to where Indigenous people were like responsible for farming and doing agriculture in a European way that was very individualistic, kind of like the continuation of colonialism and molded now into capitalism, of like you can take care of yourself and not like removing the whole traditional lifestyle from lots of people. So that was under Grover Cleveland, and it stripped 90 million acres of tribal land from Native folks and sold it back. And you can see this ad here, advertising like fine lands for sale. Yeah, definitely, Paula. I'm looking at Paula's comment about from Italy, and she doesn't own land. And I love the parentheses of owning land, but she has friends that are thinking of doing it, and she'll share the information. And I would ask that everyone in this conversation do just that. Have those difficult families with your relatives, even if they're all the way racist. Just have those conversations. They'll listen to you quicker than they'll listen to me. So yeah, so now we're gonna go into something a lot more, I guess all of it's bad, but this is a lot more triggering, I think. So residential schools. Residential schools was another layer of dispossession. So we talk about removal of Native peoples from traditional homelands, from essentially their mother, from family structures, community structures, because everything got broken up in that way. And residential schools was just another evil layer to that. And what they did was they were trying to kill the Indian and save the man by removing Native kids from their families by force, taking them to these schools where they would be indoctrinated with Christianity, taught by, taught traditional gender roles, because even only male and only female, that's not traditional to our people. There was lots of fluidity, and so that was kind of all the way cut out. Long hair was cut. Women were taught to do the women role, men were taught to do the farming role. And there was a lot of abuse that happened in these schools. And you can see a quote from Richard Pratt. And I'm not going to read it, but that's basically what they were trying to do, is they were trying to make sure that Native kids didn't have access to their family, to their culture, to their language, to adequate nutrition, to love. And a lot of our family members are survivors, first, second, or third generation of these schools. I think there's a few exceptions, but if you know Native people, their family was probably in these schools. And so you see the generational trauma, like we talked about before, just continuing. And you can see this practice being repeated today with the social work system that kind of doesn't recognize parenting practices of people that are not white, and also through the detention centers and the family separations that are happening at the border. These children are separated from their families, and it takes generations to undo that trauma. A lot of us are still learning like how to actually love people, to understand what healthy communication look like, to trust people. And that a lot of the trauma that came was inherited generationally and passed down from our relatives that were in these boarding schools. And this image is from Hampton Institute, and the next image, just so that you can see just like the change, that is from the same institute. So it's 3 Native girls before and after being and in these institutions. And then the next one is actually outside of Carlisle. And just so you can see the mass amount of children that were stolen away from their families. And a lot of us got stories that sounded less traumatic, like, oh yeah, he couldn't take care. Our family story that I just like have been processing of late is, oh yeah, your great granddad couldn't take care of all the kids, so he had to leave them at this school. And you know, my grandparents, they went to Mother Cabrini and Sherman Indian School, and those are both in Riverside. And on my mom's side, I don't really know that much about my dad's side. But it's just awful, because you know that every single one of these children in this photo was not being loved, was separated from their family. They weren't allowed to go back and see their family, except for I think like once every season. I don't remember the exact one, but it was very, very few. And if parents refused, they would be punished with like lack of food, because remember, people were separated from like their traditional homeland, so they don't always have the access to be able to grow in ways that they know can sustain their family, or they were like not allowed legally by the US occupation or government, as some people call it, then they don't have access to hunt. And these acts like of self-sustaining were punishable by law. And you can see kind of these remnants of laws in action when you look at criminalizing collection of rainwater, things like that. And I'm not saying about like hunting or going off trails. Don't do that if you're a settler, because you don't know what you're doing. So I just want to make that very clear. That's not like one of these things. For Indigenous people, yeah. Charging people to buy homes that are Native is ridiculous. Absolutely ridiculous when you think about it. Like just let that sit with you for a minute. But gonna go back into these residential schools, and recently people, and we can go to the next slide, oh, I actually forgot the slide was in here. This is a really good slide I wanted to make sure that I included. So this is about 19 people of the Hopi Nation, and what they did was they fought against sending their students, their babies, into these residential schools. And they were punished. So the photo that you see of them, they're actually at Alcatraz Island, which is, you know, the prison. And the reason that they're there is because they were fighting the laws. They were fighting the laws that took children away. They led an uprising, and they were taken to Fort Defiance after refusing to send their children to these schools. And they were arrested, and many more families, individuals, and communities did resist, but this is just one example. And I wanted to put this here because it lists all of their names, and I just think it's really important that we remember them, because a lot of comments that we get are like, oh, well, why did they send them? First, they were being punished up until death, and there were just extreme punishments for all of it, but people did still resist because they love their children. And we can keep going. And so what this is this is a map, and this is in Canada because the United States hasn't started. digging. So, and when I say digging, these schools have burial grounds, just unsacred burial grounds. I mean, they're sacred, but these children were abused, murdered, violated, and their bodies were hidden, dumped in these schools. And so sometimes we're not going to be able to find them all, because a lot of times bodies would be burned, especially when you think of the babies that were given by youth in these schools, fathered by priests out of rape. So a lot of those babies will never be returned because there's no remains to find. But there are children that were buried in these schools, and they're being uncovered now because there's a Truth and Reconciliation Committee that acts out of Canada. And there has been money to dig up these schools, return the bodies to the nation so that they can do their return home, do their ceremonies to let these children rest. And so what you see, the blue dots are the searches completed, the yellow dots, and the blue dots and the yellow dots are concentrated pretty close to the border, just in case you're having trouble seeing it. The yellow dots are kind of in the middle, we're right next to the Canadian label there on the country. And then the red dots are the searches that they haven't started searching for the graves yet. So right now we're at a total of 1,300 bodies that have been recovered from just a few of these schools. I think it's 6 or 7 schools. And there should be no bodies under any school, but we're only at 6 or 7 schools searched, and we're already at 1,300 bodies of children. And so in the next image, you can see that this is one of the communities that has done some of their ceremony, and like they're doing these memorials for these babies now that they're being returned home. And you know, of course, part of it is healing to have the babies back, but it's also just very sad. There's no way around it, because these babies, they would have been our grandmothers and our grandfathers and our grandparents by now. And they're not here because they were taken from us. Do we have questions? Yeah, I don't see any in the chat. We can, oh, my mom's here.
So I actually have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So as you mentioned, there is currently no searches going on here in the United States. How can we advocate for those searches to begin?
Yeah, I think I think that's a great question. I think I might not have the exact right. I don't know, the Canadian government, they have Truth and Reconciliation Committee, and that's kind of, it's not a joke, but it's also not, I mean, obviously things are happening, but it's not been easy. And so I think the best way is to yield to tribes and yield to like what the different tribes are asking. And so you can actually go to our website and find different homepages for different tribes and different asks. And you can also go to the Frontline tab, which at the end, I'll share my screen so we can go through it a little bit together. But yeah, there's a couple of things happening right now, like where there's a move for Congress to look for the actual missing and murdered Indigenous women that are more recently going missing. And even that is kind of hollow, because what you see there are a lot more money going to law enforcement. And what that looks like is law enforcement that is not from the community, that is not building relationships with community, that is demonizing a lot of like the actual victims. So if somebody, for instance, goes missing, they might look at her lifestyle and say, oh, well, you know, she did drugs or she did this, and then they won't take her disappearance seriously. And when we're looking at the whole picture of things, oh, okay, well, was she a survivor of residential school systems? Was she self-medicating because there's no health care? There's no fresh water. There's a shortage of housing on these reservations. And the issue that you have is not that she's missing and she was taken by an oil driller. The issue that you have is that she was using drugs. And so a lot of the even the assistance that is being given is kind of like hollow and puts its faith a lot in government systems. So I think the best thing that we can do is listen to tribes. And I think there is a massive move to put money, government money, into searching the schools. And so I can send you a link to add to the comments in the YouTube channel once this video goes up, of a site that maybe lists all of them, because I think there's too many to list. But listen to the tribes and sign the petitions and show up when asked. But yeah, thanks for your question, Elizabeth. We can go to the next one. And so this one right here, when we're talking about, we just kind of talked about it a little bit, right, is the missing and murdered Indigenous relatives, the causes, right? So right here we have a picture on the left. Her name is Gio, the one with the drum. She's standing in front of a pipeline. This particular pipeline is in Minnesota, and this line is called Line 3. It's still being drilled right now. I don't think the construction has completed. It was slated to complete this month. But this runs through tribal territories of the Ojibwe people. So I think Gio is actually from the White Earth Nation of the Anishinaabe or Ojibwe people. And also they're also Kachipwa. And so there's resistance, because what happens in these instances of pipelines going through tribal lands is, first of all, it's ruining the rice, the traditional food of the Ojibwe people, because the line is crossing through all these waterways. It's going to contaminate and is currently contaminating the waters, and it's really dangerous, not only for people in Minnesota, but for us, because it's crossing at the headwaters of the Mississippi and lots of other waters. So it's drinking water for thousands and thousands of people. So that's the issue with the pipeline. It's also destroying ecosystems, because waters are being drained from these rivers. And like I said, the rice is suffering, fish are suffering, clams are suffering. And then when there are leaks, because pipelines leak and there's no way around it, everything is contaminated, and the cleanups that happen aren't actual cleanups, they're cover-ups. And what happens is the pipeline companies pay fines. And on top of that, these pipelines aren't running through white communities or affluent communities, because it's too dangerous. So they run them through tribal territories, poor neighborhoods, Black neighborhoods. We just had the victory here with Byhalia connection pipeline being canceled, because there was massive media support. And I'm sure that not a lot of people on this call or in the city of Memphis have heard of Line 3. And thankfully Byhalia pipeline connection got media support, because this pipeline isn't getting a ton of media support until recently, because it's almost completed. And what happens when these lines are run through rural communities, Native communities, is that our women, our relatives go missing at much higher rates, because there are man camps there, and women and children and relatives get stolen, sex trafficked, murdered, and people know that there won't be massive investigations. I think on the next slide, it might be, well, that's just the police. We can go back to that one. Can you go to the next one? Yeah, so this one is kind of talking about a recent missing woman's case, Gabrielle Petito. I had only heard about her 2 days ago or yesterday, but her disappearance was covered. I don't watch the news. My mom probably knew about it. But her disappearance was covered by so many news outlets, and there was massive outcry, and everybody but me apparently knew Gabby's name and knew like what was going on. And on the left here, you can see an image, and it's another image of representing missing and murdered Indigenous women. It's a Native woman wearing a shawl, but her shawl are just faces of missing and murdered women. You can't see because it's small, but they're just faces of all of our relatives that have gone missing or are murdered. And I'm sure that people don't know. And even in the exact area where Gabby was found, in the past 5 or 6 years, 710 Native women have gone missing from that same area. Do we know any of their names from the media? No, because they're not white. And so if we go back to the pipeline, the two slides ago, yeah, we see like the way that our women aren't respected. So on the picture on the right, you have Tasha Martineau, their partner, Alex Rose. Behind them, I think is McGeezy. And they're about to be arrested violently by the police in the next picture. And the only thing they were doing in this picture was actually a ceremony on their side of the barrier, because the way the pipe, this is at Red Lake Treaty Camp. It's in Minnesota. We were just up there with Native Rights in July, in the end of July. So that was 2 days after their arrest, I believe. And the way it works is the pipeline is on this side and the camp is on this side. All of it's on Native land, but with the treaty that they have, the Red Lake Nation has been given jurisdiction, even while this thing is happening, to do ceremony and pray and resist their pipeline on their side of the boundary. And that's what was happening here, was a ceremony. And the police, as you can see in the next image, they're highly militarized police. They're paid overtime. And you can see even they're bussed in by school buses. So they're using the educational equipment to bus militarized equipment, police officers, white police officers, to stand against these women and these relatives that are unarmed. Everybody at the camp is unarmed, and this is how they show up. And they're protecting a private oil company, because even there was a cease and desist placed by the White Earth Nation on Enbridge, which is the pipeline company that is doing these, ecological terrorisms. But the police are hired to protect the oil company. They just sit there all day watching over our camps and waiting for antagonizing our people. And that's what they do. And so you can kind of see this occupation continuing today. And the same thing will happen at protests. You'll see the same thing at Black Lives Matter protests. You'll see the same thing at any protest that kind of goes against the US occupation or law and order. We can keep going. And then you can go to the next one. Yeah. So this one is just kind of showing a different map. And this one is just kind of relating that back to the conversation that we had last time about what representation looks like for Indigenous people on land. In Oklahoma, so many acres of land is Native land. It's not marked, but a lot of us probably don't know what tribes land we're on. And this map just kind of shows different sovereign places. Navajo Nation has one of the biggest reservations. Yaqui people have land that crosses over the newer borders from settlers, so Mexico and European settlers that call themselves American now. And so this is something that like we should actually be seeing on our maps, are Native lands mapped out. But we don't see that, and that's another tactic that erases us. So you see it in media when our women, our relatives that go missing aren't reported. You see it when our lands aren't represented on maps. You see it when our issues that hundreds and thousands of people are supporting are not shown on mainstream media. It's a tactic of erasure, and it allows people to continue the theft, to continue the degradation, to continue the violence against our different communities. Yeah, and so if you go to the next slide, it's a picture of a woman asking to, basically stop celebrating genocide. And we do this when we celebrate Christopher Columbus. And I think when we had talked to the Italian Society, I think that's what they're called, here in Memphis, there's like a lot of pushback on, well, we're just celebrating Italian American culture, but that's not what we're doing when we celebrate Columbus Day. This was one man. He was an abuser, he was a rapist, he was a murderer. I'm glad he's dead, but we should not be celebrating him. We shouldn't be celebrating him, because when we do that, we are continuing to tell all of our relatives that suffered and continue to suffer this occupation that it was worth it. That our lives aren't as important as Christopher Columbus's life, because he cleared a way for settlers by murder, by whatever means necessary, and by torture. Yeah, so I'll share with you in the chat here a petition that you all can sign to end Columbus Day here in Memphis. And it would be awesome if you could sign it and share it with all of your friends and in all of your medias. But this is one really small step we can take. And then on this day, we can do kind of what Paula was talking about, talk about land back, talk about how we can honor the lands that we're on and honor the people that had to be displaced in order for us, because I'm sitting in Memphis and my tribal homelands aren't here either. So how can we be in community with people that were displaced? And then, that gets into the deeper issue of, we need to make sure that all people have access to housing, have access to healthcare, education, and that education includes all of this kind of messaging, because our children are still learning in school, like Paul Revere and the discovery of America, and it's bullshit. Oh, I don't know if I can say that on here, but it is. So yeah. And we can move on to the next slide. So one other way that we see the erasure of our people and a continued kind of problem is through the sexualization or the stereotyping into logos of our people. So when we see it, it's a lot of times the women are sexualized and then trivialized. So you can see also on the Land O'Lakes cover, they took the woman out on their newer things of the Land O'Lakes. She's like sitting there serving butter. Yeah, you can go back. And then in these, they're outfits that are just kind of, there's no cultural relevance. And if there were, that would also be a problem, because that would be appropriation. But it's this image of like this sexy maiden, this sex object, because that's how we're viewed. We're not viewed as full human beings. Since contact, that was the strategy: dehumanize them, take land, and subjugate, and then take, push out until you need to extract something, natural resource, sex labor. And so when people wear costumes, it further erases us, it further places us in the past. A lot of times people will hit us up, and I mean us, Native rights, will hit us up for talking engagements around November, because people think of like, oh yeah, the Pilgrims and the Indians. This day we can learn about what really happened. Like, no, you're on Indian land every day. You should be learning about it every day. You should be giving thanks to the people that cleared the way. You should be paying taxes to the people whose land this is and continues to be, but it's occupied by settlers. And so these costumes just kind of further that stereotype of like, yep, it ingrains in us subconsciously, like Indigenous women are sex objects, nothing more. You can dress up as them, use them, and throw them away, just like you do your Halloween costume. And it's not okay, it's not harmless, it affects those numbers, and it affects our consent. And consent is a big issue in colonial society anyway, because when we think about like being in relationship to land, in order to even be on a land or use a tree to make a basket or a home, you need to be able to ask that tree, that land, that water, its permission to use it. And when you get into the issue of buying and selling a living thing like land or like women or like people, then that whole consent issue goes out the window. And you see rape is a common problem in all colonial societies, because consent and life isn't valued the same way that money is, or white maleness is. And so on the left, you see some images of women protesting the costumes sold by one company. And on the next slide, you see just the stereotypic image of merciless Indian savages, how we're still referred to in the constitution of your government today. And the two on the right are actually in Memphis. And the one on the left, they just changed the Braves from Atlanta to the Guardians. They changed the name to the Guardians, the baseball team. And but there's, there's still some fans that are like Braves forever, because this image to them is more important than our humanity. Imagine a cartoon being more important than somebody's life. And so you can go to the next one. So the way that you can support is you can, learn about the lands you're on. You can support Native rights because we have lots of things there that you can do to educate yourself further, to contribute to the causes that are happening now. I put the petition to end Columbus Day in the chat, and there are 2 ways you can donate to Frontline camps right now on our website. So I think I'll go to our website and then I'll share my screen. What is this? Let's see if I can get this to work. All right. Oh, maybe this one. All right, can you all see it? Good. All right, cool. I see Paula shaking her head. So if you go to nativerights.org, it's NTVRITES.org. Usually when you go, this is the homepage that you'll see. That's like the beginning of it. But because of line 3 and because that was such an urgent issue, we moved our marketing stuff towards the bottom. Sorry if the scrolling is making anyone's head hurt. And we wanted to make sure that people knew how to donate directly to Red Lake Treaty Camp, which is the camp I was just talking about, and the GNU Collective, which are 2 camps that are 2 organizations that are fighting the pipeline. They need resources. They need bail funds. They need medical equipment, transportation, that type of thing. So that's what you can find on our front page, because we wanted to make sure that people didn't have to look, or people need aid and support right away. And if we can't be there, we want to make sure that we get resources to them. But you'll see at the top, you can kind of navigate around this page. You can donate. Actually, we're going to do a relaunch in about 3 weeks. So our page, somebody donated time to help us make it look a bit more, it'll look more like the logo, the color, and the theme. But right now, this is just what I did because I'm not a web designer. But you can make a donation to our organization. It'll talk a little bit more in depth about what Land Back is. You can learn more about the Three Sisters Land Project, which is a project that, like Elizabeth mentioned in my bio, myself, Aileen, and Maria are trying to get off the ground as a return to land and traditions for some of the urban natives that we know, and then any other folks that want to join us. And on the right here, you can donate land. If you do own land and you want to know like how you can help, you can fill out a form that says, it'll just ask you some questions about the land or the parcels that you want to donate, and we'll get in contact with you and figure out what the best avenues for you to do that with, and the communities that you need to connect with are, and help make those connections and help facilitate that transition. And then if you want to know about like what's going on the front lines, you just click on Frontlines, and there's, just different camps that you can educate yourself. The Byhalia Connection was up there. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women USA is here, and another organization that supports more directly. Stop Line 3 is on here, so you can just kind of figure out what's going on, what causes we're supporting. You can educate yourself with the Educate Yourself tab. This is the first one. It's a Vice article. Don't usually like put a ton of stock in Vice, but it's a pretty good article about really simple things you can do. And then these are podcasts. So if you like to listen, and they're much better at presenting than me. So if you like to listen, these first 2 are really good. They're some of my favorite. I listen to them all the time when I'm like cooking or something. And it just helps me think a lot deeper about colonization and like even the ways in which I, as a light-skinned Native, as a mixed Native, as a citizen, English-speaking Native, the ways I can deepen my allyship to different communities. And then finally, if you want to not appropriate, but you love Native stuff, you can shop Native. The holidays are coming up. We have a ton of different retailers that are all Indigenous owned. And there's some really good stuff here. And if you have a Native friend, this would be a great place to shop for them. Yeah, and so there's streetwear, there's botanicals, there's makeup, there's clothing. This person is a tattoo artist, ink stitcher, and they do a lot of work for missing and murdered Indigenous women. And a lot of the times we use on our signs, we did the red dress exhibit this past May at Shelby Farms and at Geisman. And since we're not selling anything with her logo, she lets us use this image that she created for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So check her out, she's pretty great. But yeah, I think that's all I have. Are there any questions?
You've mentioned the Red Dress Project a couple of times. Do you want to fill in our audience about a little more on what that is?
Yeah, so the Red Dress Project officially was started by Jamie Black, who's Anishinaabe and Finnish. She operates out of Canada. So what she did was she hung red dresses to signify the women that should be with us but are no longer with us. And so when you see these red dresses hanging, it creates kind of like this visceral response because they're empty and there should be a woman that's like walking the rest of her journey in this dress, but she's just not there. And so her exhibit has traveled all over the world, the Smithsonian, some universities, and we wanted to make sure that since then the red dress has taken off as a symbol to help gain more notoriety and more publicity to the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous relatives. And so lots of different places have done it. And so we actually did something similar. We didn't call it the Red Dress Project because we're not associated with Jamie Black, although we do credit her multiple times throughout. But we did that exhibit here on Chickasaw Trail at Shelby Farms Park and at the Beaver Lake. And honestly, it was really sad because the tree at Beaver Lake was beautiful. People went to see it a lot, but it seems like we pissed somebody off. And the dresses that were hung along the trail at Chickasaw Lake had all been cut down and thrown in a storm drain. And so it was sad because we prayed over these dresses and we hung them and, asked to make sure that if we were creating a mistake or saying anything wrong, that our relatives would forgive us, but that, they would know that we're thinking of them. And to see these dresses that represent our women that have already suffered and passed, like thrown in a storm drain, was really, really sad. But we're going to continue it. And we are going to have an event at Marquette Park on Columbus Day, which is October 11th, Monday. I think we're still kind of trying to figure out the right time. It'll be early afternoon. My guess is around 2 to 3. But we'll bring the dresses that did make it through that exhibit to that park. If you want to see kind of what that exhibit looked like, we'll have that there. And there's actually more information on the homepage about the red dress exhibit. I think I forgot to show you all that. But it links to a really good report. So if you actually scroll down past the line 3, this is what our homepage looked like. And these images are infographics that were not created in-house. So if you click on any of them, they'll take you to the report that they're pulled from. But it's really good information that presents everything that we just talked about in a more succinct way. And a lot of the learning I did about statistics and numbers, because all I have is my personal experiences outside of research. A lot of it started here. So if you're looking to deepen your understanding, you can just go to our homepage and just scroll. We have so many resources on there for you to be able to learn.
All right, if there's any more questions for Zyanya, you can put them in the chat. I suppose I do have one more question for you, and you've answered this to an extent, but also, if people want to learn more about specific Indigenous cultures and celebrate those cultures, what are non-cultural appropriation ways they can start doing that?
Yeah, I would say the first thing is research. Pardon me. You don't want to do anything. Basically, just don't put things on. I would say one thing that you can not do is like you don't burn palo santo or sage. Those herbs that are traditionally used by Indigenous communities are, first of all, they were illegal until about 40 years ago. We weren't allowed to practice our own culture. I mean, we did it anyway, but it was punishable, right? And a lot of our older relatives, like, they won't even talk about it loudly or in areas where they can be overheard because of that. So now that these practices are legalized, now the issue that we're running into is that, like, sage is over harvested, palo santo is over harvested, and we still don't actually have access to these things because they're trending. So watch out for that. I think one of the best ways to like honor Indigenous people's cultures are to just, like I said, learn whose land you're on. If you want to reach out to their historical department, you can usually just Google the tribe. So like for the Chickasaw Nation, LaDonna Brown has been really awesome. She's one of the people that work at the history department. She actually helped us write the land acknowledgement that we use at a lot of our organized events, pardon me, at a lot of our events. And she's really good about responses. But just look through their website and just donate, buy Native, and then teach your children, teach your relatives, talk about these conversations, talk about the way that you're being in the place that you're at actually does affect. It's not a zero-sum game, but also you're being in these places without acknowledgement does affect people and does affect communities. And then learn about your own culture and learn about your own relatives, because the best thing, the person that's actually updating our website, his name is Nick Wellna. I really appreciate him. His family is actually looking into, when their family came over, what lands they were on, and seeing if they can reacquire those lands to donate. I think they have found out that they were on Lakota land, so I think they're in the process of trying to give that back. So I think that's pretty cool. You can definitely do that. Land back is one of the biggest things. And then just show up when you're asked. You can show up to Line 3 right now. You can go up to Minnesota. You can go to Washington, D.C. You can donate. You can share content from Indigenous creators. You can sign all of the petitions, do all of the things, advocate for free healthcare, advocate for free education. These things are things that are inherently decolonial, and that's what it's all about.
All right. Thank you so much, Zyanya. It seems we don't have any more questions. So thank you so much for coming and speaking with us, especially about a subject that you are very passionate about and that also I imagine is quite triggering for you in many ways. So thank you so much. Next week's program will be about the Dixons, and the program will be given by Jane Fackwin, the Dixons' former curator. So again, thank you so much, everybody, for coming, and thank you again, Zyanya.
Thank y'all, and don't forget, don't dress up like any Native on Halloween. And talk to somebody that does. Talk to them, pull them aside, have them take it off. Bye.